Good afternoon, morning, evening, whatever it is for you as you're watching this. I'm going to look at briefly going to talk about 14.4 in government text, the legislative and judicial powers. We've talked about, thus far we've talked about the executive powers, the executive powers, looking back at 14.2 and 14.3 diplomatic and military powers. Some of these we've talked about when we've discussed Congress a little bit, but let's look at it from the perspective of the president. So the president's legislative and judicial powers, again, are providing that check and balance. Number one, they make it possible for the president to check the actions of Congress and federal courts. As I said before in class, as we've mentioned, the president does interact with Congress in terms of legislative priorities, sometimes having members of Congress over to the White House to discuss legislation and legislative priorities. But at a minimum, there's three manual messages the president sends: State of the Union, which is given usually in person. There's no constitutional provision says it has to be, but it usually is. That's done in late January, early February. President's budget message. Sometimes that's done with a press conference in addition to the message, and then the annual economic report. We've talked about receiving the president's availability. What are the options available to the president upon receiving a bill? Again, they can sign it, which makes it a law. They can return it to Congress, and they can allow a bill to become that would be vetoing the bill, returning it to Congress, right, by vetoing the bill. Or they can allow a bill allow a bill to become a law by not acting on it within 10 days. But if Congress adjourns within 10 days of sending the bill, they end their session, then the president can let the measure die by not acting on it. If Congress, again, if Congress is at the end of a congressional session, they can let it die by not acting on it. That's known as a pocket veto, which sometimes does happen. So why is the threat of a veto, even if the president doesn't veto, such a valuable tool? Well, because the override is difficult. It takes 2/3 of a vote in both houses to override a veto, which Congress can seldom muster, especially in this political environment with such a narrow majority. So even the threat of especially in the Senate. So even the threat of a veto may defeat the bill or cause Congress to change provisions of the bill. For example, your book has a good graphic in 419 talking about Gerald Ford having a Democratic majority and Republican. He was a Republican president. He issued 39 vetoes, and he was not president for very long, 75 to 77, and there was 8 overrides in the Democratic Congress. Contrast that with 2005 to 2007, George W. Bush. There was 1 veto, and he's a Republican, and a Republican Congress had 0 overrides. So it becomes more common when you have a Republican president with a Democratic majority, or vice versa. But again, it's becoming increasingly less and less common to have vetoes and overrides. The signing statements are used by presidents as they approve some measures. They have been used to point out constitutional other problems that presidents have seen in newly enacted laws, or direct the manner in which new laws are enforced. So sometimes they sign statements that in addition to approving the law, to help clarify items. Presidents since Grant, and this became especially prevalent with Clinton, Bill Clinton, wanting a line item veto. In fact, they passed a line item veto act. Line item veto basically says that you can cross out, the president can cross out lines that he doesn't like in certain legislation, which could be used to reduce wasteful and unnecessary federal spending if there's riders on it that have pork. But the drawback is it does shift more power to the executive branch, because they have the right to just cross out items in there they don't like before signing the bill. Question becoming, is this constitutional? Well, the Supreme Court struck down the light item veto act in Clinton versus New York in 1998, saying that if they want to have there's provision, there's going to be a provision for a line item veto. There's going to be a provision for a line item veto. It has to come through an amendment to the Constitution. Presidents don't often call special sessions to Congress, because now Congress is in session through most of the year, so they're generally unnecessary. I think I mentioned in another when I'm talking about Congress that the last one had been called by Truman, and that was many, many years ago in the late 40s, because Congress is in session pretty extensively now. Powers of clemency. These are falling under the judicial powers. I mentioned this in class too, and when I was talking about presidents had the power to issue pardons or even reprieves, postponements of the execution of a sentence, reprieves even from the death penalty if there was such a matter that came up. Usually not on a state level, but in a federal level. Again, these are all federal level crimes that are federal. Um, that fall under the purview of the federal court system, which we'll talk about in subsequent chapters. The pardon then is the legal forgiveness of a crime. Commutation is that idea of reducing a fine or the length of a sentence imposed by a court. And then amnesty, a blanket pardon offered to a group of law violators. So these are all things the president can do. I think I talked about the pardons that Obama was issuing at the end of his term because these powers, again, involving only federal offenses. I was talking about Obama that had done some pardons with crimes that were drug crimes that where people had been given much harsher sentences in the early 90s, late 80s than they would be now, since drug laws had changed, and he was issuing some other pardons on a case-by-case basis as they saw people sitting in federal prison needlessly because he thought they were nonviolent offenders. So that would be an example of a president using his pardon power. Often they use it toward the end of their term for reasons, to avoid a lot of hearing a lot about a political backlash. So again, that covers a little bit on the legislative and judicial powers of the president.